Everyone, and welcome back to another episode of FFC&Me. This week's episode is slightly different to what we've had so far. I've had a great experience interviewing Stuart Roberts. Um, Stuart's been a Fulham fan since the '60s and has had many, many stories about following Fulham over the years, home and away. So what we've done is we've actually split this episode into a two-parter. So this is part one of my interview with Stuart. The second part will be released lunchtime today. It's a great interview with Stuart. We learn about sort of coming to Fulham uh, with his granddad and his dad, and then bringing his kids and stuff. And we learn basically what it's like to have been a Fulham fan through the ups and downs of being a Fulham fan, and again the time of being Fulham from the '60s up until today. We also have a great in-depth conversation about cult heroes, and we have a great breakdown of his cult heroes at Fulham. So I really hope you guys do enjoy this as part one of the interview. Before the Hi Stuart, how you doing?
Good, thank you, Ash. Very good.
Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so a long, not so suffering now, but in days gone by, long suffering Fulham fan from the 60s, 1960s. I'm 67 nearly in a couple of weeks, and my history is very much a family connection with Fulham, going back to the 1960s. And was originally taken by my grandfather when I was probably about 5 years old. He had property in Fulham that he was given by his father, so my great grandfather. And there's a story there because we think that he may well have been involved in actually the building of Craven Cottage. He lived in one of the big houses, or semi-detached houses, facing Bishop's Park that you walk past on your right when you're going towards the cottage from Putney. And he was a master builder, and he was around in the sort of 1890s, well, roughly when Fulham and Craven Cottage was built. So I haven't got any real evidence of that. But my grandfather, he was given by his father 3 houses in Fulham, and he used to have to go up on a Saturday and collect the rent and fix anything that needed fixing. And he used to chuck me in the back of the car when I was about 5 years old. My dad was working in those days. He worked, often people worked on a Saturday. And so I went out with my grandfather. We did this tour of the houses, the 3 houses, which were the normal sort of Victorian houses around the ground. Ended up with my Aunt Alice, who also lived in another one of the houses around Craven Cottage, and then went to the game. And I was just dragged along as probably giving my mum a break, I suppose. And so I'm pretty sure that my first place that I used to sit in was the what is now the Johnny Haynes stand, and in those wooden seats. I'm pretty sure I used to sit in those wooden seats. And then some years later, I remember I used to stand on a box in the enclosure, because obviously then it was like a mini terrace, the enclosure. And that went on for a number of years, and that's how I started to get into Fulham. And I didn't really know what was going on, to be honest, but my father was also a Fulham fan. So my grandfather that took me was actually my mother's father. My father's father and family also supported Fulham. They lived in Fulham quite near to Stamford Bridge, but for some reason they supported Fulham, not so much Chelsea. They used to, back in those days, people went to Chelsea and Fulham, for the home games one week after the next, but they always were Fulham fans. So with my mother's family going back to my great grandfather, and certainly my father's family, and my grandfather on my father's side being big Fulham fans, I had absolutely no chance, and that's how it all started, really. And yeah, I didn't really know what was going on, particularly, as I said, when I was first taken, but through the 60s I became a proper fan as I grew into my teenage years, and and it went from there. So I got lots of memories through all the years from that far back. I think it's 7 different decades that I've supported Fulham.
That's pretty impressive. Like 7 different decades. So you would have seen definitely a lot of highs and a lot of the lows of being a Fulham fan,
Yeah, well, I have to
kind
say,
of
a lot
interesting.
of lows. And the situation we're in now, I went on. I live in Shropshire, so I go. It's a bit of a hike. It took me 9 hours to get down on Friday, and I stay at my son's, who's also a fanatical Fulham fan, and soon will be taking his kids. So that'll be the 7th generation. I've got 2 grandchildren. I bought them back a home shirt on Saturday evening. So yeah, it's a long old journey from here. South Shropshire Hills is where I live, but yeah, labour of love.
Yeah, I think that was one of those things that one of the things I've noticed from talking to people that who may have been like local to Fulham when they were younger, or moved away for whatever reason. That the one thing that always stays is the definite connection to Fulham, and being a Fulham fan that will never change because you moved away. To have the dedication to still sort of travel down to games is, if you're lucky enough to be able to afford it, is definitely something that is always quite interesting for people.
And afterwards, after the game on Saturday, I ended up in the Lion with my son, and we met up with the Nordic contingent. There was 23 came over for the game that we've just had against Palace, and it took me longer to get to the game from took me longer travelling from Shropshire than it took them from Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, which is the various countries they'd all come from, which is kind of ironic. But
Yeah, well, well, I had the same issue. I think Saturday's game was probably the longest journey I've ever had in from Croydon that I remember in a very, very long time. So, public transport was not on anyone's.
the train stopped after the game as well. What was that all about? I don't know.
So
There
when
you go.
we talk about obviously your history of being a Fulham fan, and
Yeah,
you're be taken by your dad when you were younger, and then sort of getting
grandfather
involved.
initially.
What would you say was the thing that sort of got you hooked the most about going? Was it the football itself? Was it spending time with family, or was it sort of a mixture of the all?
Yeah, probably no. It wasn't being with the family. It was. I think the experience, and I mean, back in those days, Craven Cottage wasn't hugely different. I mean, it was different to what it is now, but it was 3 sides of the ground were terraces, and the enclosure was the enclosure. But Craven Cottage has still got that feel today as it had back then, and it was something to do with that, I think, that I loved. But again, I was so young, and eventually it became not so much a habit, but yeah, I mean, it was quite hard because at my school, when I went to secondary school, I was the only Fulham fan. I went to school in Staines, um, and you'd think that there'd be plenty of Fulham fans in Staines. It's not very far, but no, 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 no. They were all Chelsea. There was a few Man United and Spurs and this sort of thing. I was the only Fulham fan. I don't know whether that made me even more sort of, I don't know, determined to hold my end up for my team. But yeah, and my dad also is a fanatical Fulham fan. He's still going. He's 93, by the way. He'll be watching this,
Oh, good job.
and he hangs on to everything that's mentioned about Fulham, all the podcasts and things. He just spends all day looking and listening, and so he's a fanatical Fulham fan. So I was influenced by family for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
See, one of the reasons why I asked that is obviously because we call ourselves a family club, and we're very proud of the fact that we're a family club. And for a lot of people, it has different meanings. For me, we're a family club not just because of the way that we as fans sort of treat each other or
yeah,
get along with each other, but we're a family club because we're not a big football club. We're not a massive football club in the sense of, we're not, the most notorious in terms of winning stuff. We're not the biggest fan base in any sense of the word. So to get drawn into being a Fulham fan is usually because, it's a punishment that's passed down to you. And I say punishment obviously in the lightest way possible. Like for
Yeah,
me,
yeah.
for me, my dad was a Fulham fan, but he only really became a Fulham fan when he moved to London, sort of moved to West London, South West London when he was sort of like late teens.
Mm,
But on my mum's side of the family, my family have always been Fulham fans. Like
mm,
my auntie Frida, who was the lady who sort of took me to football through most of my sort of age 9 to age sort of 17 when she stopped going because she became a bit too frail to go. She influenced me massively in terms of being a Fulham fan. Not just because she used to take us to games and buy us shirts. She took us to away games too. So most of our sort of early memories of being pushed into being a Fulham fan are because of her. And it's a sort of similar reason why I asked that question to you about your grandfather taking you and then your dad taking you,
yeah. I
and
mean,
why that's so important.
my dad, once I think his work situation must have changed because he then did start coming, on a very regular basis, and we certainly did lots of away trips when I was now, becoming a teenager, early teenager. And I remember going to places like Bristol and Bristol City and Bristol Rovers. I remember going to Bristol Rovers when they were playing at their old ground. What was it called? I forget the name of the ground. It was actually a Greyhound Stadium, a bit like Waltham Green, but smaller. And sticking Fulham signs in the car. I used to write Fulham on a piece of paper and stick it in all the windows and have the scarves hanging out of the windows and all of this sort of stuff. And you're right. I started to meet people regularly that you see every week. So where we stood on the terrace, they were the same guys, and you chat to them, and they were your Saturday football mates. It wasn't so much a pub culture in those days. Well, I was too young for that, but people didn't go to the pub so much. I don't think in those days it was more to the ground. But yeah, you made football mates that you saw on a Saturday afternoon. It was, and that is what is also very. You're right. It's very special about Fulham are the fans, because I don't know. There's something different about Fulham fans that I don't know. Whether it's the humour or it's the. I think I don't know. There is a huge difference between a Fulham fan and a Chelsea fan, and yet the clubs are a mile apart. But a Chelsea fan, I know you shouldn't generalise, and I know there's nice Chelsea fans, but they are, if you've got a meathead of a fan, he's not going to choose Fulham. He's going to choose Chelsea, and I've seen that time and time again. And at school, I got bullied quite badly because I was the only Fulham fan. But Sodom, I was a Fulham fan. That was it.
Well, you say that you were the only Fulham fan. Your school was in Slough. I was the
No,
only
in
Fulham fan in my
Staines.
year. In
Staines.
Staines, sorry. I was the only Fulham fan in my year, and my school was in Putney.
Yeah,
So
right.
it's one of those things. I
There
do
you
I do
go.
get that, and I understand what you mean about what makes us different from other football clubs. And one of the things I think I learned quite young is the ability to laugh at yourself.
Yeah,
Gallows humor. Being a Fulham
yeah,
fan and
yeah,
having gallows humor is
yeah,
definitely a thing.
yeah, yeah,
I think I wouldn't have survived as a kid if I didn't have the ability for people to go, "Oh, like Fulham are rubbish," and not be able to go, "Yeah, I know."
yeah, yeah.
I know,
I think
so it's
somebody
one of those
once said
things.
to be a Fulham fan, you've got to have a sense of humour and like children.
Yeah, that's probably correct. So we'll talk about when games that you remember going to. Obviously, you
Yeah,
saying you've been going for over sort of six decades now, or 7 decades, as you say.
yeah, yeah,
What are some of your sort of like moments of being a Fulham fan, that because you obviously going to have memories of the good times and the bad times.
yeah,
Can you sort of explain to those of us who sort of aren't old enough to live through it, or just not know what it's like, um sort of the hot and coldness of it, like the good experiences versus like the terrible times that we had sort of
yeah.
during the 80s, So like made like FA Cup finals and stuff like
Yeah,
that. How does
yeah,
that sort
yeah,
of go together?
definitely. So the '60s was a pretty interesting time. We had a fantastic team, and you know, with people like Haynes and Cohen and Marsh and Mullery and these sorts of guys, characters like Tosh Chamberlain, and I do remember a lot of those. But the thing that was really hurtful is that as soon as we seemed to get somebody that was really good, we'd sold them. And I remember we sold Rodney Marsh to QPR. Now Marsh played 200 games for QPR and scored 100 goals, and we just sort of gave him away to them. And we did that sort of thing all the time. And in the '60s, we did that with Marsh. Then we did it with Alan Clark. So Alan Clark or Sniffer. Have you heard of Sniffer? Alan Clark.
I've heard the nickname before, and
He
I've
was
definitely
part of
heard the
the.
name Alan Clark before.
He became part of the great Leeds side, and he played for England many times, and was a multiple goal scorer. But he was a Fulham player that we acquired from Walsall. So he wasn't actually born and bred in Fulham, but he was a young lad that we picked up and was outstanding. And even now I'd put him up there with Louis Sahar and people of that level. He was at that level. He was absolutely at the top of the game. And because we got relegated, he didn't want to play in what was then called Division 2. So the Championship was Division 2 back then. And so Fulham sold him to Leicester. A lot of people think we sold him to Leeds, but we didn't. We sold him to Leicester, and then he played a few games for Leicester and then went to Leeds. But it was a UK record fee that we got for him, which was £125,000, which is nothing now. But in those days, that was the most anybody had ever paid. So that was kind of okay. We got a fair amount of money for him, but we didn't get £125,000. We got a player called Frank Large, and Frank Large plus a bit of money. I think it was probably half of the fee was Frank Large. And Frank Large was absolutely useless. I mean, he was a real trier, but he couldn't score to save his life. And he played for us the next season. So when we got relegated, it was '68. And then Frank Large joined us. And would you believe we were that bad that we got relegated again and went into Division 3. So and there's a funny story about that, the Flags story. I don't know if you know the Flags story. So along the what is now the new Riverside stand, that was a terrace. That was an open terrace, and along the back of it there was a flag for each of the first division clubs, including Fulham. And obviously they changed every year as people got relegated and promoted. But, whilst Fulham were in the first division, which I think was about 10, 12 years, the flags were there. And when we got relegated in '68, the chairman, who I think was Tommy Trinder, said, well, I'm not going to change the flags. We're not going to change the flags because we only intend to be in Division 2 for one season. And he was right, wasn't he? We went down to Division 3, but he didn't mean that. He meant we were going to go back up to Division 1. So we had the Alan Clark situation, and then after Alan Clark, we had Malcolm McDonald. Now Malcolm McDonald, again, we had him in the 1960s, at the end of the 1960s, '68, and Malcolm McDonald went on to be a prolific goal scorer. He scored a huge number of goals for Luton, who we sold him to for nothing, peanuts. And then he went to Newcastle, and his career record over sort of 400 games, or getting up to 400 games, was a goal every other game. So he scored 200 goals for these clubs, and we gave him away. And it was apparently because he didn't get on with Johnny Haynes, and at the time Johnny Haynes was the stand-in manager. So it was grim, and I was as a sort of fanatical young Fulham fan, so upset that we find these good players. And McDonald was clearly a star. I mean, he was our top goal scorer when we got relegated from Division 2 with 5 goals. But I think he played 15 games, and he was a kid, and he was obviously massively talented. You could see it. I remember Brian Moore on the big match. We used to have a Sunday game that was like Match of the Day, but there was a Sunday version called The Big Match, where they featured local teams. So London, Fulham got on there occasionally. And they featured Malcolm McDonald because they recognised what a good player. And said, well, Fulham, it's looking really tough for Fulham this year, but at least they got this young player. And we gave him away. It was unbelievable. Gave him away to Luton. And the rest is history. He played for England and he was a great player. So it was really difficult. That was the 60s. And then into the 70s, we sort of then transformed into a sort of a lower league club, really, for quite a while. We eventually got promoted back into, so we're in Division 3, and then we got promoted into Division 2, and we got Mullery back. Alan Mullery played for us in Division 1 as a younger player, and then went to Spurs, again, another player we sold, who was a top player. And we got him back, not in the twilight of his career, but the later stages of his career. And we also signed Bobby Moore. And we had a few other good players, younger players like John Mitchell, who still does some of the entertaining at Craven Cottage, in the corporate sort of facilities. But Mitchell was a young player, and he helped us get to all three of those players helped us get to the cup final. And we had a pretty decent side, and we got to Wembley, which was unbelievable. It was the most games that any club had ever played in a run to Wembley. Because remember, we were a Division 2 club, so we started off before the Division 1 clubs. And in the
but that can't be beaten now, can it? So that's it will never ever be beat unless one of the sort of non-league teams that have to qualify somehow make it all the way through to the final. That will never be beat in terms of most games played to get to a final.
I think the first two games we played, I can't remember which way round it was, but Hull and Nottingham Forest. And one of those went to two replays, so 3 games it took us to get through. And the other one, it took us 2 games to get through. So by the time, I think it was almost before the third round proper, we'd played 5 games. And, it's a bit like actually the trip, the experience of the road to Hamburg and the Europa League. That was a game, that was 19 games, wasn't it? Or something crazy like that, because we had to qualify. And eventually we got to the FA Cup final. And it was incredible because Fulham had never done anything. And it's a bit like now, when we got to Hamburg, or even when we started to win things under Al Fayed's leadership, it was incredible for Fulham fans to see success because we'd never had it. And that was a little blink of success that we had in 75, and it was amazing. And I was at Hillsborough when Mitchell scored, and we went to Wembley. Got a story about that. I mean, Dad and I had tickets. In the programmes, we used to generally buy a programme in those days because there was no internet, and Fulham were never in the papers. And so you bought the programme to get the information on the club. And in the back of the programme, there was a little bit in the corner, which was a coupon. And you collected these programmes, and when we got to the cup final, they made us cut off the coupons. And if you had a certain number of coupons, and I had every one, I went to every game that season, then you were guaranteed a ticket. So we got a ticket through the coupons, and then another ticket another way, and they were in separate parts of the Fulham end, which I think was the tunnel end, back into the old Wembley, of course. Mm-hmm. And we had to get together. I was so 75. I was 19, and we had to ask another Fulham fan to swap tickets with us, so we could, I can't remember whether it was Dad's or my ticket we used, and we swapped tickets so we could be together. And the Fulham fan was, happy to do that. The first one we asked, and I'm not sure, that would. There was a lot of trust involved in that, really, if you think about it. And that's typical of Fulham fans, isn't it? And so that was the 70s, and then of course Best and Marsh turned up, and that was a great little period. But it was never really. It was always kind of never going to really lead anywhere. It was entertaining, great fun, and the crowd loved it. And then, of course, in the 80s, we had the Malcolm McDonald team, which was outstanding. But we had probably 12 players. And it was the beginning of the early Clay and Bulstrode days when it all went completely pear-shaped. And Malcolm McDonald put this fantastic team together. And we got a guy called Ray Howson, who you may have heard of. He does punditry now, I think. We got him from West Ham on a free transfer. And he ended up becoming a world star that we gave away because we were in a lower league, and he got an offer from a Premier League side, or it wasn't a Premier League, Division 1. But do you know the Division 1 side he went to? I mean, this was enough to make you want to weep. Oxford United.
Oh gosh!
So he went from Fulham to Oxford United, who were at that time, I think they were in the Division 1 for a couple of seasons, and then of course he carried on being a superstar, and he was just fantastic. Tony Gale played in that Fulham side, so he's on Sky you see him a lot. A lot of great players. Robert Wilson. Hi Rob, probably watching this. That team was just perfect, and it was an inch away from getting promoted back to Division 1, but we needed some more players, and I think we had about 12 players that played regularly, and they just ran out of steam. Dean Cooney, who was the centre forward, the goals dried up. And because we had Gordon Davis, of course, Gordon Davis was the star man. He was the goal scorer, bless him. And because Clay would not put his hand in his pocket and just let McDonald get another couple of players to get us over the line, we eventually fell away. We lost a big game at home to Leicester 1-0, and Gary Lineker was playing. It was one of Lineker's first games, and for Leicester. And Leicester pipped us right at the end. And then that Fulham team fell apart because we didn't get promotion. And it was such a shame. So a great season, but it ended in sort of, and all back to square one again. And then we had the Fulham Park Rangers nonsense. And then into the 90s. And of course, the 90s was terrible, where I remember going to Torquay when Torquay was bottom of Division 3. No, sorry, bottom of Division 4, and we were second from bottom of Division 4, and we went to Torquay and lost. And we were in a lot of trouble. I mean, there was 3,000 turned up at Craven Cottage. There was like tumbleweed blowing around the terraces, and it was just awful. And then Mickey Adams joined as a player from Southampton, and he's recently been at the Cottage, isn't he? He was given the award. And Mickey Adams was then became the manager. I think Ian Branford pushed him to become the manager, and he put this wonderful team together, the famous Mickey Adams team that people to this day talk a lot about. Of all ragtag and bobtail team it was, but we had some super players. Darren Freeman was fantastic, and some other good players, and we got promoted. And of course, that's the famous promotion where we ended up joint top with Wigan, and Wigan had an inferior goal difference, but Jimmy Hill, who was then the Fulham chairman, had come up with this idea of it should be goals scored.
Goals scored,
over goal difference. It's the only season that ever happened, and so we came second rather than first because it was the one season it was goals scored and not goal difference. Now, if that isn't Fulhamish, I don't know what is. And that's classic Fulham, isn't it? I mean, you have to laugh at it. It's kind of like, it's either.
We are the only club. We are the only club that
you,
can have a chairman that would bring in a rule at the FA that would mean that we don't win the league because of something like that.
Unbelievable. And then, of course, Mickey Adams opened the door by getting promoted with that side I don't know that Al Fayed would have bought Fulham if we were in Division 4. I don't know. I
No.
suspect he was kind of, he saw that we'd been successful, and that maybe gave him a twinkle in his eye, and he turned up and bought Fulham, and the rest is history, isn't it? And it was Fayed's money that did the rest, really. And then we ended up. He said he wanted to get in the Premier League in 5 years, and we did it in 4. And that took us into the 2000s, and we've been a yo-yo club, but I mean, in up until this season. But to me, when I look back at what my history is with Fulham, all right, the early days, the 60s, they had a solid Division 1 side, but and there was a comment that I think Tony Khan made that he got absolutely lambasted with when he said, "I'd give my right arm to be a yo-yo club." Well, so would I in those days, because to be a club going between Division 1 and Division, I couldn't imagine being in Division 2 when things were bad. To be in Division 2 was like a dream. Or now the Championship, I call it the Championship. Yeah. So being a pretty well established, relatively wealthy Premier League club, even with our small fan base and everything else, is just. We live in the dream, honestly. We really are. And the younger fan base, I don't think really realised quite how bad it got. It's good fun, but it was also tough. It was miserable losing on a Saturday and getting beat by Torquay and all these teams.
I was there. I remember. I was only a child, but I was there. See, the thing is,
You
for
were
me,
at Torquay?
I was. Yeah, I'm one of those people that
I must have been sat next to you.
I'm of that age that I started going to Fulham when I was 10 weeks old and went to my first game, which was in 1989. So I've been going to Fulham pretty much week in ever since. So because I've sort of brought up left in a pram at the front of the Hammersmith end, like that's how it was for me for my dad to go to football and stuff like that. And I'm one of those people that I'm exceptionally lucky that I've seen Fulham play in every single division. And my time at Fulham has only ever been sort of I missed the decline of going all the way down to the bottom division, but I've been there for the whole time of going back up to the Premier League. And even for me as a kid, sort of falling in love with football as like a 5-6-year-old who went to football every week, but 5 or 6 is when I first sort of realised how much I love football and love Fulham. I still had those experiences in the bottom division, and the dream of ever playing in the Premier League, because obviously it was a thing then, was miles away. It was never going to happen,
No.
as a Fulham fan. I was overjoyed when those things happened. And Mickey Adams, as we talk about Mickey Adams, and anyone who follows me on Twitter will notice my sentiments towards him getting his Forever Fulham award. Mickey Adams is the first Fulham manager that I properly remember, and that group of misfits and that he had that got us promoted through spirit alone. It felt like half the time, or spirits alone. I don't really know what necessarily the best way of putting it, but Mickey Adams is a hero to most Fulham fans, and those of us who were old enough to have seen him manage or even play, because he was a player manager, obviously. He is an absolute hero to us, and what came after him is just sort of magic. And you say that one of the things I noticed about when you're talking about your time going through Fulham is that we had an awful lot of extremely good footballers who played for Fulham. Some we had when they were young, some we had when they were sort of coming to like the twilight of their career. You look at George Best and and players like that, and Bobby Moore, and players that come at the end of their careers. We've had some exceptionally good footballers that have played for this football club, and we were just really, really unlucky in my eyes, in the sense that the young players that we had that were outstanding, we never kept. As you said, because we could have pushed on for long shot. And one of the funny things is this conversation I had with my little brother a couple of weeks ago, and my little brother's he's just turned 21, so he doesn't sort of have the same memories of playing in lower league football as I do as a kid. And I remember giving my pocket money up as a kid to part of like the Fulham 2000 and stuff like that, and we were in some really dire straits as when we were even in the early 90s. the club was in some. It was absolute. The place was crumbling. The stadium was falling apart. You never really knew at the end of the season who was coming back the season after. Not because not because of we weren't good enough or were the players good enough, but more just a case of who are the club going to pay in order for them to want
Did you
to
get a
come
brick?
back. So
Did you get the brick?
yeah, I did get a brick. Yeah,
I've got a
one
brick
one
in
of
my
one.
garage. I got a brick.
I'm no longer in possession of the brick. But
I've got my brick still.
I did get a brick. But it's one of those things that for me.
But honestly, Ash, back in the day, and I through that little bit of history, the club was very, very badly managed. I mean, if you think the club's badly managed now, and I know the Khans come in for some rough treatment or have had some rough treatment, and a lot of it justified, ticket prices and various things, but and the transfer market. But compared to what it was like, the club is run infinitely better.
No,
And I know people get very
one of
fed
the
up
things.
and pissed off, but honestly, it's just a different world now to what it was.
100%, 100%.
And we gave
One of the
those
things I
players
say,
away.
no, nothing.
Great
Well, it's one of the
players
things
gave away.
I always talk about it with my brother and my cousins that go to football. That we regularly have this conversation. The problems we have now are worlds apart from the problems we had when I was like young,
Yeah,
and the problems that we have now are how much money are the club going to spend, not is the club going to exist next season, which for
yeah,
me is a massive difference. Obviously, you sort of had the experience of sort of going through that, and probably more than the most of the people I've spoken to so far on this show, because you would have done it. Well, one of the things I would like to just sort of hit on is
yeah,
we'll talk about, obviously later on we're going to talk about sort of your cult hero entry. I know you've done something a bit different with that, which we'll
yeah,
talk about in terms of players. But some of the players that the commitment from players we've had, it's been different. I know that football clubs tend to have players that are well known and sort of well remembered by Fulham fans, but Fulham have had some players in the past that have saved the club in the sense of the way that they've stayed loyal, and even players that sort of left and come back. You look at like Rodney Marsh, who was probably one of the first players that I've ever remember being told about, who obviously was sold and then came back later on in his career. And maybe he came back for different reasons than other players would have done. But we've had many players that have left and come back, and there's got to be a reason for that. There's got to be a draw to why players come back. Even look at players like Gordon Davis, who either is Fulham's highest ever goal scorer. Mitro may one day touch that record. We don't know, but even he was sold and was bought back again, and
yeah,
he was sold and ended up playing for Chelsea, which is even worse
yeah.
than most of the things. But he's still,
Yeah.
for someone who left,
And he
when
still
he
loves
was
Fulham.
first progressing.
He's at most games, and he still absolutely loves Fulham. And when you, yeah, it's there's something about it. It's a bit like the fans. I think the players are similar. You could argue Johnny Haynes started that trend. Maybe I don't go back beyond Haynes, earlier than Haynes, but I mean he was a world star. Haynes. He was one of the best players in the world, and he only ever played for Fulham. I think he went to South Africa for a little while, but he was virtually retired. So he only had one club, and that's a great example. England have never won the World Cup without a Fulham player being in the team. There's all sorts of great players we've had through the years, and but we haven't ever hung on to them in a sort of cohesive way. I mean, at the moment we've got some absolutely massive players playing today, and if we can just keep hold of those players and add to it, and we've now got a really rich guy who owns a club who can afford to do pretty much what he wants if FFP allow it. There's no reason why Fulham can't become quite a force, which is really exciting. And compared to when Trinder was running it, and really it was a musical joke. He used Fulham for his sort of on stage laughter,
Mhm.
and yeah, it's happy days. It really is, really is. But it wasn't always like that.
So we'll just go back to sort of yourself, and we'll talk about yourself. One of the things I always like to sort of ask people is sort of when you come to games, sort of what your normal match day sort of routine is.
Yeah.
When you attend games, what is your normal routine?
Yeah, so a home game, I'd be. So I live in a little market town called Bishop's Castle in South Shropshire. It's quite near the Welsh border. We have a bus that goes out of here twice a day. So I get on that bus, I use my bus pass, and I go up to Shrewsbury. And this season, I've been getting a National Express because all the train strikes. And I get a National Express via Birmingham down to Victoria. And this is on a Friday. And then I jump on another bus, number 2, to West Norwood, which is where my son lives. And I go and stay with my son on the Friday night. So it's a Saturday afternoon kickoff. And I'll stay with James and I'll see the grandchildren. My wife sometimes comes with us. And then on a Saturday morning, we'll do stuff with the kids and then head off about probably 11:30 and get the train similar to your journey, but we go from West Norwood via Clapham Junction to Putney Bridge, and then we'll walk down Putney High Street and probably go and eat one of the pubs. The Coat and Badge, I think James he goes to quite often. We went there a few times. I like the Bricklayers Arms. Obviously, there's a Red Lion. Sometimes I don't go to a pub. Sometimes if I'm a little late, I'll go into the ground early and have a drink in the ground. Yeah, and then watch the game, and then afterwards we'll go to have a drink. If it's a good win, we'll maybe go back to the line if we can get in, and a sing song, and then back to Putney Station and back on the same route via Clapham Junction to West Norwood. So that's. Yeah, and then celebrate hopefully a good result.
Okay, cool. So with that being your normal routine, there's two questions that I'm I'm going to ask you because I ask everyone who comes on the show. I'm going to do them slightly differently way around just because it's going to meet better with your routine. So, do you have any sort of match day superstitions and stuff that when you go to games that you have to follow?
Yeah, I've got a funny one that's not actually when I attend, because when I watch a game at the ground, I'm sometimes nervous, and it depends how much is on the game. We've had some big games in recent times, none more than at Wembley. That last 20 minutes at Wembley was almost, you couldn't watch it. But the superstition I have, which isn't so much a going to game superstition, it's when I'm looking for the result. So if I'm not at the game, and I have a superstition about how I find out the score, and I avoid getting scores, and I hate listening to it on the radio. I'm nervous as hell. I'm okay if I'm there, but to listen to it, and Gentleman Jim, who's brilliant, I love Gentleman Jim, but to listen to the commentary and then suddenly he'll go quiet and go, "Oh, they've scored." It's just beyond awful. So it's getting the score, and I always get the score via my iPad in a certain way. Absolute nonsense, but that's what I do.
See, I always love asking that question because it's one of those things that you know it, it's getting in sort of the psyche of a football fan, knowing that
Yeah,
we there's nothing we do that, especially if you're like 200 miles away, that's gonna physically change the course of the game. But I always get it because I have them too. I won't listen to games on the radio if I can't watch them, then I won't listen to the radio. It's the same thing. So I sort of understand that.
yeah,
Um, Sure, we're gonna go to my favorite last question to ask everyone for the
yeah.
getting to know you section, which is about we always get really excited when we meet other Fulham fans, especially sort of those of us who don't spot many Fulham fans that often. So where is sort of the craziest place you've ever sort of bumped into another Fulham fan?
This is a great story. I'll take a few minutes if you allow me, but
No, yeah, go
um,
go go.
I mean, this is very Fulhamish, my lifetime. But when we started had this real success in '78, when we had Kevin Keegan came in, and from that period until Tigana took us into the Premier League, we lived in the US. I had my company sent me on an assignment to Connecticut in the US, and a lot of people know me as Stu in CT because I had it on the back of my shirt, and it was my handle on the forums. They were the first forums that we ever set up. So I was in the States, and game time was from Eastern time was at I think it kicked off at 10 o'clock in the morning, and there was a forum called the Fulham Independent, which is still going, which was actually started off by a guy called Paul Thorpe, who then became, up after a year or so, became the Fulham IT manager for a little while. He's still around, and his son is a fanatical Fulham fan. And there was an offshoot from this TFI, the Fulham Independent, called the Fulham Independent Exiles. And the exiles were guys that lived in the States. And we went onto the Exiles forum, and we sort of figured out that wouldn't it be fun if we all got together during a game? So we used to get on a forum where it was a bit like a message board, but everybody could contribute at the same time and talk about the games as they were going on. And it was like the first one that could find out if we scored. And when somebody found out there was a goal, they'd type GGGG, and it was the year when we had Paul Pesce-Salido and Jeff Horsfield and that lot playing. And so there was probably about, I don't know, generally about a dozen of us on this forum. Anyway, Barry probably, decided that we should all get together. And it was decided we should all meet up in Las Vegas. And so that closed season, after we got promoted, was it the first season under Wilkins when we didn't get promoted? It just doesn't matter. Maybe it was the Wilkins season before Keegan took over. But we all decided we were going to go to Vegas. And so I can't remember who organised that trip. And so we decided we were going to go to the Rio, which is one of the big hotels in Las Vegas, just off the Strip. And for me, it was I think it was 2 flights I had to take, and we flew over. I think there was probably about 10 of us that went on this trip, and we all met up in the reception area at the Rio Hotel, and started looking around for who are these other guys that I've been talking to for the last, for the whole season on a Saturday morning that I've never met before. I mean, there was nothing like this where you can see each other. All it was typing on a screen. And we worked out that we were all of fairly similar ages, and we gradually bumped into each other, and sort of hugs, and oh, you're Luther, and oh, you're Wilkin, guys from Canada, and Hong Kong Andy, who I met the other day actually at a game, and he's coming back now from Hong Kong. But yeah, we all met up, and that was bizarre because it was quite nerve-wracking in a way, because never met these guys, and we were committed for the weekend with them. We had the most brilliant weekend, and they're good mates of mine to this day. And we did the Vegas thing 4 times. I did it. I think they've done it a lot more than that. I don't know if it's still going on a regular basis. I don't think it is, but Keith, and I've got other stories about the Exiles, but lots of stories actually. But they're a bunch of fun guys that like a drink, and they love their football, and they're Fulham absolutely to the core. Yeah, that was pretty weird meeting those guys that I sort of knew but I didn't know in Las Vegas for a weekend's boys trip was something else.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. And it's always great to sort of hear those stories about, when you get to meet people that you know. And I've had it, since I've started doing this show, that people that have come up to me at games that have watched watched an episode, and they recognize me, and and they come and say hello, which is sort of a bit odd, but it's great because it's why I do this sort of thing. I wouldn't make a show where I am trying to get to know other Fulham fans and sort of why we become Fulham fans if I didn't want to then hear other people's stories about it. So
Yeah.
it's one of the things that I found that it's quite cool that we had that. I've had a few people that have messaged me and then never really met them before, and then they've come up to me at games, and you put a face to a name, and it's pretty exciting. So I sort of definitely get that.
And it's funny because we went when we were at Wembley, the Villa game, which I'll talk a bit about, but I was bumping into these guys. There's 38,000 of us, and all of a sudden I go, "Oh, there's Dodger," and you sort of hugs and things, and Luther turned up, and these guys, in 38,000 there, and we're bumping into these guys I hadn't seen for 10 years since I've been back, and oh dear, amazing.
That's excellent. That's true. I think I have to do things a little bit different with this show than I usually do, because we've gone on a bit about the stories of growing up, which has been great, and I don't want to cut any of them out when we edit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a break here. And I'm going to release this episode as a two-parter. So that was obviously the end of the getting to know you section, which I've had great fun getting to know you. And we'll come back with a second part.